Greetings and welcome to today's webinar on how many students graduate from college in your state. My name is Kenneth Terrell and I'm Project Director for the Education Writers Association. Now to introduce your host for the day, our good friend Scott Jaschik. Scott is editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, where he co-leads all editorial operations. Additionally, he has published articles about colleges in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and Salon. From 1999 to 2003, Scott was editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he is a graduate of Cornell University. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Mr. Jaschik.
Hi. Hello, everybody. It's great to have so much interest in this report. For those of you who don't know the National Student Clearinghouse, it is a great resource not only of reports like this, but for lots of stories that you may be working on. A big frustration that I have, and I know many of you have, is the lack of timely data on key questions. And as you'll see today, the National Student Clearinghouse frequently has timelier and better sorted data than many other sources. So it's definitely worth getting to know the people there and their capabilities to help you with many articles. Our presenter today is Afet Dundar, who is Associate Director of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. In that role, she produces the Research Center's signature report series, National Reports on Student Outcomes, and helps to develop the center's research agenda. She's contributed to numerous publications on student access and success outcomes and presents regularly on these topics at professional conferences. Prior to joining the Clearinghouse, Dr. Dundar was Assistant Director for Research at the Project on Academic Success at Indiana University, where she was closely involved in the design of a national survey to identify and document policies and practices associated with student persistence at institutions across the U.S. So with that, let me turn it over to her to lead us through PowerPoint. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, joining NSC. And we are very excited at NSC to present our third annual college completions report, state-level college completions report. As you may know, this is the third year that we are releasing college completions at national level, sometime late fall, and a few months later, we use the same cohort that we used at the for national level results to produce the results at the state level. And for this year's report, we are using first-time degree-seeking students who entered colleges and universities in fall 2008, and we are following them for 6 years through May 31st, 2014. We mentioned it at the national level report that there is the uniqueness about this report this year is that the cohort that we are using is the cohort of students who entered colleges and universities during the Great Recession year. So in that sense, and this was the first report that focuses on their completion outcomes, not enrollment of students who started in Great Recession, but their actual outcomes, completion and persistence outcomes. Student outcomes we are looking at this report include degree certificate completion and continuing enrollment. With continuing enrollment, we mean whether they were still there at the end of the study period, which was year 6. We are reporting student outcomes by enrollment intensity, whether they were exclusively full-time, part-time, or mixed enrollment, by age at first entry to college, by age in fall 2008, and by gender. I want to say a few things about the definitions in state-level analysis. The state that we are using is the state of the institution of first enrollment in fall 2008. Students who started in multi-state institutions are excluded from the starting cohort. This doesn't have a lot of impact on this particular report because most of the multi-state institutions are for-profit institutions, and later I will mention that at the state level report we didn't do any analysis for students who started in for-profit institutions, but it has an impact a little bit because some multi-state institutions are nonprofit institutions, and if students started there, we excluded them because we wouldn't be able to put them in any state. Completions, on the other hand, at multi-state institutions are included. When I will talk about the completions at the starting institution or elsewhere, overall, the total completion rate for the state includes completions at multi-state institutions as well. State-by-state results, we are reporting them for students who started at 4-year public institutions, 2-year public institutions, and 4-year private nonprofit institutions. When you see the report, you will see that we don't have the results for all states, and that comes because of the historical data coverage. We are reporting the results only if, under each of these categories, 3 institution types, if the state institution type has the historical data coverage at least 65%. Then we do report their results. And for 4-year public institutions, we were able pretty much do for every state. But for 2-year public institutions, I believe we have about 40 states there. Before I actually go into the results for some states, I wanted to mention a few things. At NSC, we don't rank the states. We do not rate the states based on their outcomes. We are hoping that we can give these results to enable informed discussions, to enable informed decision making. We are hoping that states will discuss these results in detail, or other stakeholders will discuss this and to answer why questions, because they will have more state policy contacts and they will answer those why questions. But we are hoping that these results will enable a lot of discussions. And in the report itself and in this presentation, I will talk about the results for some states, but you will notice that again, the states are listed in alphabetical order. It's not based on their completion rate. And I selected on some slides, you'll see I selected some states really just to show some points, but if I have a point in selecting particular states, I will mention it why I selected those states. And in some cases, I don't have any reason, I just wanted to show some examples. And I also want to say that, again, there are lots of results for 3 institution types across most of the states. So there are a lot of data points. I picked just a few. Hopefully it is interesting and it will be interesting to you, but I'm hoping that really the more detailed discussions, you will look at the report, what states interest you, and we look forward to seeing a lot of interesting articles based on this report. The one thing that I mentioned on this slide, you see a few states here. I do have a reason why I selected these states. These are the states' completion rate for students who started at 4-year public institutions. And these are the states that had total completion rate over 70%. And the first column shows their total completion rate for that state. Then I have completion at starting institution and completion at different institution. One of the strengths of the Clearinghouse data is that the students can move from their starting institution elsewhere, and we are able to track that student, and if they complete it elsewhere, we will be able to see it. And here you see the second column really shows the completion at the starting institution, and the last column, completion at different institution. If we focus only at the completions that happened at the starting institution, we see that some of them were at 60-something%, but some of them were below 60%. And only when we add the completions that happened for students that went elsewhere, transferred to a different institution, and finished there, we see that these states reached at least 70%, and most of them were even higher. This slide makes somewhat similar point, but I wanted to show you something. I don't have any particular reason for selecting this whatever. What I'm gonna say is very common. It happens in other states' results as well. This in the first column here, we see completion at starting institution for these states, and the last column shows students who were not enrolled at the end of the study period, which we can call them non-persisters. Some would call them dropouts. Some will call them stopouts because they might come back after we ended study period. So, and in the middle, I have completion at different institutions. And depending on what data source the researcher uses or the policymaker looks, whatever data source the policymaker looks, this middle column can go with the first column, as it happens in the data that we are using. It can be combined completion at the starting institution, but it can also be combined with not enrolled column, because if the data doesn't allow to see students who go beyond the starting institution, we will see all transfer students as non-persisters, as dropouts. And the picture for the state will completely change if we do that. A good case here, example, is Minnesota. If we look at Minnesota, completion, the first column shows about 47%, and last column shows 16%. And if we combine completion at different institutions, if we add them to the last column, the completion rate for Minnesota will look at 47%. And the non-persistence rate will look at over 40%. But in these results, again, our total completion rate actually combines the first and second column. And as you noticed on the previous slide, Minnesota's completion rate becomes over 70% when we do that. I selected this point for this webinar, the completion rate for mixed enrollment students, because this is the tradition that we started 3 years ago when we first released our college completion report. We started reporting students, grouping students in not only full-time and part-time groups, which is mostly that's how it's done in the research. We grouped students as exclusively full-time, exclusively part-time, and also mixed enrollment students. The students who started full-time and then they dropped to part-time status, or the vice versa, they started part-time, then became in full-time status. And at the national level results, we saw that mixed enrollment students actually over half of the cohort for fall 2008, and it was the same in previous cohorts as well. At the state level, if you look at the results in many states, in fact, for students who started in four-year public institutions, only 11 states have where mixed enrollment students only 1/3 of the cohort, and in the rest of the states, mixed enrollment students are at least half of the starting cohort. And in really many states, it's 60%, 65%. So it's not an exception for students to change their enrollment status. And this is not something we have in the report, but we looked at the mixed enrollment students. About 2/3 of them actually start in full-time status, and for different purposes, for different reasons, they drop to part-time status later in their study, and only 1/3 starts as part-time student, then becomes a full-time student. So, and my point on this slide is that, and mixed enrollment students also are the students that for whom the larger proportion of completions happen elsewhere. So they transfer. It is more common for them. They transfer to another institution and they complete there. Perhaps enrollment status is kind of overlaps with changing the institution. So we're here for selected states. Again, I don't have any reason for selecting these states. These are just examples to show you. I have a few states here, and I have total completion rate for them. And the second column has completion at different institutions. And then I have completion at different institutions over total completion, the proportion of the completions that happen at different institutions. The third last column, this is what it shows. So, and for the states, and it is very common for other states as well. This is just an example of 6 states. At least 1/3 of the completions for mixed enrollment students happen in a different institution. And the reason why I'm making this point, because mixed enrollment students who start in full-time status are going to be in conventional, traditional graduation measures because they start full-time. So they're going to be in the cohort, starting cohort, but they will transfer to a different institution. They complete there, and we will lose them. If we are looking at only completions at the starting institution, we will lose them when they complete. We will not see them when they complete. We will see them as leaving their institution. So that was the statistics I wanted to show you on this slide. Here, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have the results for 4-year public institutions and 4-year private nonprofit institutions in the report. And here, I selected some states in terms of their total completion rate for students who started 4-year public and 4-year private nonprofit institutions. In some states, students who started in public institutions have higher total completion than those students who started at private nonprofit. In some states, the opposite is true. But on this slide, my point is really show you how completions elsewhere really happen for all students, for students who start at public 4-year institution and at private nonprofit institutions. And I selected a few states. The first and third column show their total completion rate for that state. And second and last column show actually the completions that happen, the completion rate of the starting cohort that happened at institutions that were not the original institution, that was not the starting institution. And it is very similar in some states. It is about 13–14%. For some states, you can see that completions elsewhere is higher for students who started in 4-year public institutions. It's Missouri and Nebraska has very high rates of completions elsewhere. In the next few slides, I would like to mention a few things about the completion rate for students who started at 2-year public institutions. And we did a little bit different for students who started at 2-year public institutions. Throughout the report, both at the national report and at the state level report, we are looking at the first completion. Once the student, we see a completion for student, they go to the completion group. However, for students, because it is very important to look at students who started in 2-year public institutions or community colleges, and they go to a 4-year institution and complete there, they transfer to a 4-year institution and complete a degree at a 4-year institution. We wanted to continue tracking them after they completed at the 2-year institution. So we look at those first, and after whether there were any second or third, any completion at 4-year institution. And we are reporting them as the first completion at 4-year and after receiving completion at a 4-year institution, after receiving a credential, a 2-year degree at their starting institution. So in many states, at least a quarter of completions for students who started at 2-year public institutions happened not at the starting institution. And in fact, in 16 states, 1/3 of all completions for the starting cohort, the cohort who started at community colleges, happened not at the starting institution. And that institution elsewhere could be a 4-year institution, could be another 2-year public institution. Actually, at the report, you will see the results for 2-year public institutions, total completion rate by state. In this presentation, I will mention just a few things about the completions at 4-year institutions for students who started at community colleges. So not the total completion rate, but the completions that happened at four-year institutions. So I have a few states here, and I do have a reason for why I'm showing these states. At the national level report, we saw that the total completion rate at four-year institutions for the cohort that started at community colleges was 16%. 16% of the starting cohort who started in two-year public institutions or community colleges, within 6 years, by the end of the study period, they had a degree from a four-year institution. So they transferred and received a degree. These are the states that this percentage total completion at four-year institution is higher than that national average. So it is at least 21%, and in Kansas it is 25%. And the first and second column really differentiates whether they completed that four-year without two-year degree. So they started in a community college without receiving any credential there. They transferred to a four-year institution, and they received their first degree at four-year institution. The second column shows completion that happened at four-year after receiving a two-year degree. So they stayed in their college, starting college long enough to get a degree, and then they transferred and then received their four-year degree by the end of the study period. And the last column shows the total completion of these, the total of these two columns. And here I'm looking at the same outcome, except I'm looking at separately for men and women in 11 states, and I have just a few listed here. At least 1 in 5 women who started at two-year public institutions completed at a four-year institution. So on the previous slide, I showed five states had an overall total completion at four-year that was over 20%. For women, when we look at separately for women, for women who started at two-year public institution, in 11 states, 20% or higher had a four-year degree, and only in 2 states this was the case for men who started in community colleges. In the report, we have results after we show all these results by enrollment intensity, by gender, by age. We have 3 tables where we are showing separately for students who started in four-year public, two-year public, and four-year private nonprofit institutions, the total completion as well as the completions that happened at out-of-state institution. So their degree, the degree that they received, was not only from the institution where they started, but also it was not the state where they started. They went to they transferred to a different state, and they received their degree at a different out-of-state. And when I say out-of-state, it is a state that was different from the state where they started. And this is depending on what data source we are using, we may lose seeing them. Once they leave the state, we would see them as non-persisters, students that left their college without any degree. But if we can track them when they change their institution and go to transfer to an institution in another state, we see them as completers. And in the first column, we have total completion rate for these selected states. And the second column shows actually the percentage of the starting cohort that completed in a state that was different from the state of the starting institution. And the final column shows the proportion of the completions that happened. So the second column is the percentage based on the starting cohort. The last column shows the proportion of completions for that state for students who started in four-year public institutions in that state that happened in a different state. So in other words of saying it, it's 12% of students who started in Hawaii and completed, therefore 12% of those completions happened in a different state. And I should, at the very beginning, I mentioned that we excluded multi-state institutions from the starting cohort. in this percentage, actually in the report itself, we are reporting multi-state institutions, but there is a different column for that. It is a small percentage, but I don't have it here. This is only these multi-state institution completions at the multi-state institutions are not included in this state out-of-state completion column. But it is in the report if you would like to see it. Tracking students who start in college in one state and in complete in another, as I mentioned on the previous slide, substantially adds to the overall completion rate. I had just a few states there, but it happens in most of the states, and I have it here in 24 states. More than 5% of the starting cohort in 4-year public institutions completed in a state different from the state of the starting institution. And this was the case for students who started in 4-year private nonprofit institutions in even more states, in 37 states. And I have the some results for students' completion rate by age. As I mentioned in the report, we are reporting. We have the results for students whom we call traditional age students who were younger than 20 at first entry in fall 2008. We have a group of students 21-24 who were 21 to 24 at first entry. We call them delayed entry students, so they didn't enroll in any college or university right after graduating from high school. And we have adult learners, students who started at college over age 24. And as we could expect, as we have seen it in previous reports, in most states, traditional age students starting at 4-year public institutions had higher completion rates than the delayed entry students and adult learner groups. And this was somewhat interesting point that I have it on this slide. In 6 states that I'm listing here, delayed entry students had actually a higher completion rate than traditional age students. These are for students who started at 4-year public institutions. Finally, I wanted to say a few things about the implications or what we think about these results. This report continues demonstrating the value of counting student completions that happen at schools different from those where students started. We see that in the majority of states, I showed you in different contexts, different results. In the majority of states, not tracking completions elsewhere would have resulted in reporting at least 1/3 of the students who started at 4-year public institutions as dropouts, as non-persisters. This is in an earlier slide. I showed how completions elsewhere, if that percentage is combined with non-persistence percentage, it increases the state's non-persistence rate if we can't track students who transfer and complete in a different institution. Most students are not exclusively full-time or part-time. They switch from one status to another. And I had a slide for mixed enrollment students where I showed you their results. And so a lot of students, it's not an exception anymore. Students change their enrollment status from full-time to part-time, or they start part-time and then become full-time. And these are the students who are more likely to finish elsewhere. They're more likely to finish. The really bigger proportion of the completions for mixed enrollment students happen not at the starting institution. At least 1/3 of the completions, and in many states it is 40–45%. Turn now to Scott for questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, which is, so watching this, I'm thinking, should we journalists stop quoting the federal completion rates?
Our goal is show you the comprehensive data, but those decisions, we are not making the decisions what source you guys should look at. We are just showing you what our data can capture and what we are losing when we are not capturing, what information we are not capturing when we are not using the data that can track students across institution types, across states.
And I guess just related to that, can you go to the institutional level? Because I have been told many times, and I suspect many of my fellow journalists on this program have been told many times by a college, we're way better than our federal rate shows. Can you verify that if we have a specific college that is making that point?
We act as an agency of the institutions. We can do it if the institution authorizes us. Yes.
So here's a question from one of our listeners. What efforts, if any, are underway to connect these completion rates back to individual school districts or individual high schools? Can you tell where people started?
We have a high school benchmarks report where we are looking at post-secondary enrollments, college access, and success outcomes for high school graduates. So in this particular report, we started with the students who already started in post-secondary institutions. But in high school benchmarks report, we start with high school graduates, and we look at the enrollment rates and then persistence rates. But we haven't done it at the school district level. We do it at low income, higher income, low minority, high minority, and urban versus rural locales, but we haven't done it at the school district level.
Another question from a participant. For students who start in one state and complete in another, which state gets credit for the completion? How do you avoid double counting?
Well, the state that where the completion happened, if the state just reports the number of completions, yes, the state where completion happened, they will report it as completion, but they will not be able to say, they will not be able to include them in any kind of cohort, in any cohort completion rate. And the state that where the student starts, in most of the cases, it will not be counted. If not in any case, it will not be counted as a completion if the student left and completed in a different state.
Well, and I guess if I could ask a follow-up question there, what's good? We journalists like to write about, is a given college doing well or not? If the starting college is losing a lot of students and they eventually finish, is that a good sign that they launched them, or does it raise questions about why so many are leaving? And here I'm not talking about a community college.
Right. I was going to say, if it is a starting institution, is a community college, and they have a lot of transfers to a four-year institution and completions at four-year institution, I think it's a very good thing. If it is a four-year institution, it really depends. If they transfer to another institution because there was no program or for the reasons that really was not relevant to institution's performance, and they're still able to finish there, they can take certain credits because they prepared these students.
Here's a question from Melissa Korn from the Wall Street Journal, who notes that you talk about how some graduation college completion measures wouldn't include these students who completed elsewhere, but your data do include them. Can you point to other measures that don't? Are we talking about iPads, state databases? And I guess, in addition, maybe if you could just talk about the ways that you're counting students who the federal graduation rate does not count.
Yes. So starting with the starting cohort, the conventional measures usually include only students who start in full-time status in fall, whatever year the study focuses on. We start with all first-time students. In fall 2008, for this study, it was fall 2008. Everybody who started as first-time student, we include them, whether they started as full-time or part-time. That's one difference. The other big difference is the completions. They start in one institution. If they move to a private institution, if they move to a different 2 years, they were in 4 year, they moved to 2 year, or as I said, to a different state, we will not lose them. Even if they move to a multi-state institution in the completion, we will not lose them. We will include them in the completion, which is not the case in many other data sources.
Here's another question. Is there any information on how many veterans are completing bachelor's degrees each year?
In the report, we don't have any results on there.
And maybe are there other demographic groups for which you do have data that just to inspire the reporters for future stories?
Yes, we do have race ethnicity information, but for this particular report, the coverage rate was not enough for us to use, but we are hoping that we are getting there. We do have very good enrollment measure data element. Again, so far, the coverage was not high enough to use it, but we are hoping that in the coming years, we'll be able to use them.
Hold on, let me just look for, on the charts tables, could you clarify what's in the table? For example, the one about the completion of those starting at 2 years. We actually had several questions that related to what's in and not in the tables. And I think, I might be wrong, I think there are no figures for those who are still enrolled but haven't earned a degree, and that might explain, we had one question about why numbers weren't adding up to 100.
Right, that's correct. In the report itself, we will have a separate column where it is still enrolled students, and we define still enrolled as the students who had enrollment records in the last year of the study period. Yes, once we have it, the columns will add up.
We also have a question about what you mean by private nonprofit from somebody not familiar with that term, and the question is Harvard, Notre Dame? I assume the answer to that is yes. So you're just distinguishing between for-profits, private for-profits, and do you have data on completion rates of those who go to or from for-profits?
Who go from 2 to 4, or who start at for-profit?
Either.
We do have data for 4-year for-profit institutions. We do report results at the national level. The national level report that we released in November has results for students who started in for-profit institutions. We do not do it at the state level.
We have a few questions that have to do with what's counted for or against a state. So when you were looking at states, are you talking about started in the state or finished in the state?
Yes, in this particular report, the state is the state of the institution of first enrollment. First enrollment in fall 2008.
And in the full report, will people find all 50 states?
Yes. The numbers actually, if you add up all this in the state level numbers, it will not be the same number that we have in national, because in the state level, we excluded students who started in multi-state institutions, and also if the state institution type, the coverage for state institution type was below 65%. In other words, if we had only less than 65% of all students in that sector for that state, we are not reporting the results. We think it's not high enough to report the results.
So I want to get at sort of what's good, because as I'm looking at your different statistics, and it's clearly the case, for instance, that if I remember correctly, there were higher four-year graduation rates without the community college degree than with the community college degree for two-year to four-year transfers. And yet we sort of praise community colleges with high graduation rates. How do you should we not be focused on that so much?
Well, the thing is that in this particular report, we are focusing only on the completion. So we don't know how many more transferred. In a different report, we actually saw that if they transfer with a degree from two-year institutions, they are more likely to get a four-year degree. So here, yes, because the more students transfer without a two-year degree, that's why the completion rate is higher. But as proportion of who transfers, if they transfer with a two-year credential, they are actually more likely to graduate from a four-year institution as well.
Okay, there's somebody who wants to return to a question about whether states whose students start in one and complete in another are counted as non-completers in the first state.
Yes, it will, depending on the, yes, in most databases, if the data wouldn't allow to see when the students leave the state, state longitudinal databases usually wouldn't allow that. we wouldn't see, the data wouldn't allow to see if they go to a different state.
As you look at this, obviously our participants are all journalists. What would you suggest that they write about? Obviously from whatever state they're in.
Right. Yes, that would be one thing, because for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of data points, a lot of interesting things by age, by enrollment intensity, by gender. But I chose just a few points. I would encourage to go beyond really what we put in the press release or what I said in the webinar, and I would be really more than happy to accept the questions by email, and if they have any questions, to go into details of the state level results, really.
So I think we are going to wrap up now, and I'm going to turn it back to Kenneth. But thank you so much, Afet, for a great presentation.
Thank
Kenneth?
you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Scott and Afet. This has been a really, really great discussion, and I hope it got or generated a lot of story ideas for our members who are online. So thank you again, and have a good day.